Good evening, everybody. This meeting is a very important meeting for the Republican Labour Education Forum because we really need to get our ducks in a row for the general election, which has been called for July the 4th. And so we've got a program that we would very much like to get into the left generally and have different parties and independent candidates adopt the Republican program that we've been working on for about 2 years now. So this is a very important meeting to get those ideas, to get ideas from other people and not just from ourselves, and to have an open and frank discussion about the way forward and what we should be pushing for the general election. So I'm going to say no more, but give over to Steve Freeman to chat to you about the topic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Carol. I thought I'd start with a bit of Shakespeare. I'll call this Something Rotten in the State of Denmark, a famous phrase from Hamlet. And so what I wanted to talk about is that we have an analysis of what is going on. We've been developing analysis of what is going on. And we're trying to make that in terms of a policy and a program, and we want to influence the rest of the left if we can do that. And of course, an election is a perfect time to do that because that's when more people are talking about politics and thinking about politics. And sometimes in elections, of course, lots of things are suddenly thrown up as out of the blue that we never thought of, and become crystallized. When the election was called, Starmer made a speech about democracy, and he said the election was a moment when democratic power returns to you, the people. And obviously under our constitution, we get this momentary event, maybe about once every 5 years, when 3.8 million of us in England get to cast a vote that will decide something about the nature, the composition, let's call it that, of the Parliament, of the House of Commons for the next period of time. And it always reminded me of the Roman festival of Saturnalia. Do you remember that? I don't know if you know that one. One day, the Roman slave owners served their slaves with food and drink. It's a festival. And the world is turned upside down with the slave owners supplying the slaves. But it's only for one day. So the next day, once the festival's over, all the slaves get back to being slaves again. So in a way, it's a way of emphasizing we're in charge, not you. And I suppose in some ways our election is a little bit like that. Of course, the king obviously gives his first minister permission to dissolve the House of Commons and hold a general election. And when the election was called, and it was a surprise election, most of the legislative program was ditched. Two of the bills that survive in what was called the wash-up, they call it the wash-up, were rushed through the Commons to receive the royal assent. And what were those two of those bills anyway? One was the Post Office Offences Horizon System Bill, which quashed all the convictions by the Post Office and the Crown Prosecution Service in England and Wales and Northern Ireland, but not Scotland. And then the Victims and Prisoners Bill, which includes compensation for the victims of the infected blood scandal. Now that's quite significant because it means that these two scandals in many ways capture where this country has, where we've kind of got to. In a way, it tells us about the state of the country. These bills were rushed through because they tell us about the Crown's priorities. In some ways, the game is up on those. The Crown really is in a hole and decided to stop digging any further, and it's decided to get itself out. So many other bills went down, but those two bills went through. And so in some senses, the Crown was abandoning its policy of delay, lies, obfuscation, and gaslighting of the victims. They've had to come to that point. So I think Something Rotten in the State of Denmark, therefore, is an apt phrase from Shakespeare. And for me, it describes correctly and scientifically what we call the UK state, the Crown. our constitution and system of government is based on the sovereignty of the Crown and Parliament. So I think that the words that we might use about the present period that we're in, and I think that period goes back to 2007-8, is rottenness, decay, decomposition, degeneration, decline, stagnation, corruption. It has been described as broken Britain, measured in various collapses of all sorts of things. We could just take the water industry as just one example, but there are so many examples of rising poverty, crumbling schools, failing healthcare, overcrowded prisons, housing situation, terrible for many people, falling living standards, and the collapsing and underfunded public sector. So it's not what is rotten in the state of Britain, not the state of Denmark. And it's not just the Crown in Parliament. It's not just the political access linking Westminster, Whitehall, Downing Street, and the Palace. And the monarchy and the House of Lords are in some ways easy targets to moan about, because they're not elected, accountable, or subject to recall. But the real failure that we've argued is in the House of Commons as a democratic institution. So that one of the things that we want to raise is, what is the future of the House of Commons? And what should we do about that? It's not just the political system, it's the welfare state, it's the economy with low wages, low productivity, low investment, and low growth. And there's what was described recently, I think, by Wes Streeting as cultural rot, decline and decay of Britishness, attitudes, values, belief systems associated with British nationalism and patriotism as well are also rotting away, I think we might say. So where does this period go from? And I think if we're going to say, where does this come from? It comes from the 2007 financial crisis, the collapse of Northern Rock, and the financial crisis, banking crisis of 2007-8, when the state spent 850 billion to prop up the banking system, and so many of the things that followed on from that particular crisis. It's important to make this point, I think, because it suggests that just getting rid of the Tory government and having a Labour government doesn't fix any of these much more deep-seated crises. Switching from one to the other. If you're listening to Keir Starmer, then as soon as Labour wins the election, all right, as soon as he gets in office, then somehow these problems are going to be sorted. But our first point is to say, these problems are so deep-seated, they're so deep-rooted, and they go right the way back to 1945, if you like, and they go right the way back to 1979 and Thatcher, and they go right back to 1997 and Tony Blair, and then to the banking crisis of 2007-8. We are in we call it, as we've said, a state of degeneration. Our political and constitutional system, the post-1945 social contract that had been in decline, that was being destroyed by Thatcher with privatization and neoliberalism, is now in a state of almost collapse. And you could take the water industry as a kind of metaphor for the whole state of the nation. And the election is a time to think about the state of the nation. And part of this is, we also, just to not forget this, it's not just about our constitution and political system, it's also about our British values and what might be called cultural wars that seem to be breaking out. The ruling class is desperate to re-energize Britishness, and hence we see politicians flying the Union flag and the flag of St. George, both Tories and New Labour. You've never seen such an outbreak of flag flying in my life as we've seen in the last couple of years. But that's not, they think if they fly flags, this will somehow, this decline, this state of putrefaction in our national culture will be sorted out. But of course it won't. It merely reflects that decline and can't be done by flying flags. The British, of course, we have two flags. We have the Union flag and the flag of St. George. And Starmer, of course, has been flying many of those. So I think that we've got, before we go on to discuss who we should vote for, what we should do in this election, because we're not standing candidates at all. We don't have any candidates. So what we want to do is to try to influence the movement in whatever way we can. And one of the first slogans that we have adopted is the idea that another England is, well, I say is possible, and another England is necessary. Possible means it's something that can happen. Necessary is because it has to happen. It must happen. Now, I want to say something about this, because this is one of the slightly controversial things in our politics compared with the rest of the left. England is a nation with a long history, language, culture. It's not going to disappear anytime soon. It may disappear and become irrelevant once world capitalism has been replaced by world communism and nation states have disappeared. But that's not where we are at the moment. So the actual choice that people face is, what kind of England do we want to live in? What kind of England do we want to work in? Do we want it to become a racist and fascist England, a British England, or a democratic England? And what determines the future of people living in England is the class struggle. So the slogan of Another England, which we adopt, is a call for the working class movement in England to take seriously the need for democratic, political, social change in England. And of course, we wanted to represent that idea in the form of flags, given that flags embody cultural attitudes and values. So some of you, I'm sure, will have seen our flag, but we'll just fly it again for the minute. But we have this flag that we are going to promote during the election campaign. You can see it's got three. It's a tricolor flag. You just get, most of you have seen it, I'm sure, but some of you haven't. It's got three colors in it, and the three colors in this flag, of course, they represent different things. But in the traditional Republican flag, they represent the ideas of liberty and freedom, not freedom for capitalist exploiters and dictators, but freedom for the people and democratic rights. And we can't have a free England and, by logical extension, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, under the present regime of the Crown in Parliament. Equality is another one in the tricolour. Equality means that it's about the fight for equality on the grounds of disability, sex, sexuality, ethnicity, class, religious, political beliefs, etc. That's another very important value for us. That can't be, and of course, class in a country that has princes, dukes, earls, knights, lords, all the rest of it. No, so that can't work. And then fraternity, which originally meant humanity or the brotherhood of man, of course, that's like a sexist term there, man meaning humans, but what it meant, international solidarity. So in a way, the French Revolution gave these values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But the reason we got these three particular colours to symbolize England was that the green represents the Levellers, the first democratic party in England in the 1649, the Leveller movement that fought for democracy and overthrew the regime of Charles. But the red also meant liberty in the French. There was a liberty cap, but also you can see that the red and the green go together to represent the Chartist movement. They were two colours in the Chartist movement. The first mass working class party in the 19th century that fought for democratic rights and votes. So the red and the green go together. And then, of course, at this side, the green and the violet, these are the colours of two colours of the suffragette movement. So we've seen in this flag, basically, our representation of the English people's long struggle for democracy, which actually, in fact, you can go right the way back to 1066. When the Crown and when the long historical 1,000-year struggle between the Crown and the people and the Commons took place. So we wanted to sort of symbolically represent the idea that we don't accept the flag of St. George, we don't accept the Union flag, but that we do need a democratic England, a Republican England based on liberty, equality, fraternity. So we want to be able to represent that idea in that way. Now, I would want to go on and say a little bit more that our idea of another England is captured with the idea of a Commonwealth. So our programme is about, just keep my eye on the time there, Carol, the idea we've talked about is the Commonwealth of England. And so in some ways that word summarises some aspects of the programme that we're talking about. Now, the Commonwealth, what's meant by a Commonwealth? Well, the Commonwealth has two roots. It's in the commons, as in Commonwealth, and in wealth or welfare. And so the Commonwealth is a society dedicated to the health and welfare of the people. Commons means the common people, the ordinary people, the common land, the House of Commons. It's, again, in our history. Commons is an English term for people, meaning Marx's idea, not the ruling classes, but the people. And in welfare, and in welfare, and in wealth and welfare, you have. And I did notice as well, I was looking back into some history. Cicero in the Roman Republic talked about the health of the people being the highest law. It was given prominence in Locke's second treatise. So Tony Benn used the word Commonwealth in his 1993 bill, his Commonwealth of Britain bill, whose aim was to establish a democratic, secular federal Commonwealth comprising of the nations of England, Scotland, Wales, and the phrase is dedicated to the welfare of all its citizens. And the bill then set up, in Tony Benn's bill, national parliaments for England, Scotland and Wales. And you'll notice in that we've actually got parliaments for Scotland and Wales and one in Northern Ireland, but we didn't actually have one for England, which is one of the things that we get to put into our platform and programme. Now, the point about the idea of a Commonwealth is it's not something we've invented for the future. It's something that has already been achieved. It was achieved in the first Commonwealth of 1649, when the people of England, through the New Model Army, got rid of the monarchy, got rid of the House of Lords. They abolished it. It only took them about a month to do that. And then there was to be a written constitution called the Agreement of the People, and it's when the diggers started to take over and occupy some of the land. All right, and there was a lot of for a short period of time, a lot of democracy within the New Model Army itself. But we know that Commonwealth, the first Commonwealth, was overthrown by Oliver Cromwell's counter-revolution. I think you'd have to go forward to 1945 to see the idea of a second Commonwealth. And it was called, funnily enough, there was a Commonwealth Party between 1942 and 1946. But the second Commonwealth was established during and after the Second World War, following the Beveridge Report. And the Labour 1945 Labour Manifesto says their ultimate purpose is the establishment of a socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain, and goes on to talk about that. So you can see 1945 as a Commonwealth, but not a republic, because it really was a compromise between the ruling class, the Crown in Parliament, and the working class that was in the form of the soldiers and the workers who had actually fought during the Second World War and wanted to come back to a different Britain, a better Britain. But that second Commonwealth, you could say, continued till 1979, when Thatcher came in, defeated the miners, and then began to dismantle the second Commonwealth. So when Benn in 1993 is talking about a Commonwealth, a new Commonwealth, really, he's talking about the third. The point about the Commonwealth is it's not something in the future we're inventing. It's something we've already done. It's been done by thousands, tens of thousands and millions of people in England in the past. So it's something which is possible, and it's something which is achievable because it's something that has already been done in the past. So that's the idea really then of the Commonwealth. So I'm going to, somebody will say this, and then just keep in mind on the time again, comrades. Why England? We talk about why Commonwealth, why England? Well, as Republicans in England, we want to establish a Commonwealth in England, but we do not want to impose a Commonwealth on Ireland, Scotland and Wales. The working classes in these nations must win power or sovereignty and decide for themselves what kind of future they want. Winning power means becoming sovereign democratic nations. So as working class Republicans in England, we are internationalists. So we're open to a federal republic, with a united Ireland, Scotland, Wales, but we're totally committed, but we are totally committed to abolishing the undemocratic unionist constitution by which England, 85% of the population, exercises political domination and denies self-determination to the Welsh and the Irish and the Scots. So Ireland, Scotland, Wales must become free nations, that is to say, free to decide their constitutional future. And working people in England are not sitting around like a reactionary conservative dead weight. As internationalists, we have to be militantly proactive in dissolving or abolishing the union. That is to say, the quicker that's done, the better. And the quicker and more peacefully it's done, the more likely we'll end up with a federal relay. We'll be able to have a federal, closer, better federal relationship with the other nations that make up the British Isles. So I think that all of the nations of the UK, republicanism is anti-unionist. It's anti-unionist in Ireland, it's anti-unionist in Scotland, if you're Republican Scotland, it's anti-unionist in Wales, and we as Republicans in England are also anti-unionist, but not out of narrow national chauvinism, but out of a sense of internationalism, because we want the closest possible for a relationship with them. So let me just come to, well, what did we just come to what we might say about the present general election? Well, I will say a couple of things about what does the programme of the Commonwealth entail? I think, if I could just say this, for the Commonwealth of England, we want to speak about the idea of a parliament for England, the thing that Ben talked about, which we don't have. But we're talking about a parliament based on citizens' assemblies, based on regional assemblies, coming with sovereignty coming from below, elected by a parliament elected by proportional representation, with MPs elected, accountable and subject. So a really democratic parliament for England, coming, as it were, from below. We want to speak about that. We also want to speak about the rule of law, because the rule of law is usually a right-wing thing, but it's always the right-wing politicians talk about the rule of law. But we can think of the rule of law as in a sense, the way in which the people should be able to control society, the way that laws are decided by the people on behalf of the people. We want the rule of law, not the anarchy of the market. Tony Benn has a point in his bill where he says that what we've got in this country, nobody has access to the law. And he proposes to set up a national legal service so that every citizen can go to law, can have access to the law, which at the moment is just reserved for the rich. Public ownership of land, we've talked about that quite a bit. I think, again, we're the people who are going to take that point up. The left tends to forget about this, but we've discussed the idea of the nationalisation of all the land, taking into public ownership and local democratic control of land. And we've also talked about other things that would come from 1945, like a fully funded, free, comprehensive health and social care system, community defence, education. We're not going to go, and I'm not going to go beyond that now, but many of those things are things that are there, that they're not utopian things. They are things that we all, it seems to me, it's achievable. I'm going to finish up really on this point, that to say that the general election, and we're talking about if we come back now to the general election, and to remind ourselves that the general election in Ireland, Scotland and Wales is different. It's fought in a different way. In Scotland, the general election is basically between the Unionists and the Nationalists. And it's the same in Ireland. And it's not quite the same as that in Wales, but it's coming to be more like that. Whereas in England, we have a much more traditional Labour versus Tory. So the general election in England is different. Labour's themes about the election campaign were chaos and change. And in answer to that, chaos is something rotten in the state of Denmark. So we've covered that point, really, that the chaos which has been created not purely by the Tories, but by the collapse of our social and political system. And change. Well, Keir Starmer's not going to change things. But I think we could think about there being four parties in England. We've got the Reform Party, which is really the English Nationalist Party. We've got the Conservative and Unionist Party. We've got the Labour Party. But then we've got something else that's been happening. We called it we've got a Palestinian movement. We've almost got a Palestinian party emerging because of the crisis in the Middle East and the involvement of the Crown in the war in the Middle East, supporting Israel's war massacre, ethnic cleansing, genocide, etc. And this is driving a wedge between the Crown and the constitution and political system and a section of the population, hundreds of thousands who have been out demonstrating on the streets and protesting over the last 6 months. And that's also exposed, I think, the degeneration of our liberal democracy and highlighted the growth of Crown power and taken it to another level. So I see in the Palestinian movement almost a mass Republican movement, or to put it this way, a people's movement organized on the streets and on the campuses. And I'm using the term Republican here to mean not anti-monarchy particularly, but rather grassroots, popular, mass movement of citizens, regardless of ethnicity, sex, sexuality, race, religion, all those other things, supporting peace and democracy, self-determination. It includes trade unions, religious organizations, members of political parties. And because of the general election, this movement on the streets that we've seen has now crystallized into a Palestinian party. Now, when I say party, I don't mean an official party. I mean a party meaning a section of society that's trying to stand candidates in the election. So let's end up with this point. What we want to do in the election is obviously make the case for a Commonwealth of England, to make that case for an English Parliament, for a new written constitution, for all those things that I've said. That when we come to the election, we should be absolutely anti-Tory. Voting is about attitudes. For the last 14 years, we have suffered from the most reactionary anti-working class Tory government since the days of Thatcher. That government must be ousted, smashed, cut into 1,000 pieces, destroyed, defeated, so badly that it never recovers. So I think no mercy for the many crimes and murders, robberies, corruptions that they have committed. So I don't think we should be anything other than very, very strongly. I don't think that I'm not muted to make Starmer a more bigger enemy than the Tories. I think Starmer is the enemy of the people, but it's different. Labour, of course, I'm not in favour of. In voting against the Tories, I think we have no special preference for the Labour Party. The Labour Party is the only party that can probably form an alternative government on its own, or perhaps through a hung parliament. But in some constituencies, you might decide to vote for a Labour candidate. In others, the issue is completely different in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. But we should vote for the Palestinian Party, I would argue, which includes assorted socialists such as Corbyn, Andrew Feinstein, Chris Williamson and others, not on the basis of their programmes particularly, but if they campaign to support the Palestinian people and they support Julian Assange. And I include the Green Party in the Palestinian Party, by the way, because they've also, I think, as far as I understand it, I might be wrong on this, have also taken a good stand on Palestine and support Julian Assange. I might be wrong on that. So I think that how we vote is not the important thing for us, but how we try to get over a message that another England is possible. We need something because of this degeneration of our country, the broken Britain that we're now living through. We need something very much more radical. All that will happen if Starmer wins the election, which seems likely, is that very soon people are going to realise there have to be something else because this is going to get us nowhere. But I'm sure, comrades, you've already worked that one out just as I have. Anyway, I'll finish there. I hope that's given you some food for thought.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Steve. That certainly got the ball rolling. I know it's a word that we use a lot in our meetings, but we don't often define it in a very, very clear way, and that is what we actually mean by the Crown. So the question I'd like to ask is, can you or Phil or anybody else that comes to our meetings regularly define exactly what we mean by the Crown? And I'd also like to raise the spectre of the City of London as well, and the power that wields as well, and what weapons we have in our arsenal to fight that kind of power. But Malcolm has already got his hand up, so I'm going to bring Malcolm in straight away.
Yeah, I agree with almost everything that Steve says, except one thing that sort of put me in the eye, really, and that's the whole business about England, a word he used a great deal. As I've been living in Portugal for a very long time now, as you probably know, and I have Portuguese nationality and I speak Portuguese fairly fluently, etc., etc. But one thing I do know is I'm never going to be Portuguese. Never, never in a million years. And because what I am, people always say, what are you? Is I'm Southern English. And it's only recently that I really thought of England being divided into two. And when you think of these other so-called countries, Northern Ireland, Protestant Catholic, divided completely in two, Wales, North-South, completely divided in two, Scotland, I'm not really sure about lowlands and highlands, or independence or not. And I think England's divided into the north, between the north and the south. And having been born and brought up in the south, and then going to the Midlands as a teenager, it was very clear to me that the north, which I actually preferred to the south as it happened, was quite different to the south. So this whole business of countries, I mean, I've often thought as well in the past that why have we got all these countries? Why isn't it just called Britain? And why are everybody producing all these barriers and different things? So if you're in Scotland, as far as I know, you can go to university for free, but if you're England, you can't, so on and so forth. So it all seems very strange to me. And so I'm not at all clear, or even perhaps agreeing with Steve about the whole business of English, and because I, as a socialist, think of countries being abolished, of course, and people not living in countries. I mean, you're clearly going to be associated with some group that you grow up in, and how different that is to other groups, of course, is important. But so I would just like to agree with everything that Steve said, except I would take England out of what he said. It's really quite a lot of what he said. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm. I'm going to bring Ken in. Ken Syme.
Yeah, Malcolm has already said much of what I was going to say. And listening to Steve, he began there's a general election in England. And it was later on that he actually mentioned Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. But it does trouble me that the focus seems so exclusively on England. I say this obviously as a Scot living in England, but I do very much agree with Malcolm's point that we should be internationalists and we should be looking to abolish nations and not reinforce even smaller divisions into even smaller nations. I don't know, Steve, if you've had any success at all in establishing links with Scottish Republicans or Welsh Republicans or Irish Republicans, recognizing that the latter term obviously has different associations. But it does strike me that, if you continue to focus exclusively on England, you're in danger of potentially reinforcing a sense of English nationalism and exclusive rights, as it were. And you will then be in difficulties in trying to establish relations with the other parts of the United Kingdom. So I would be in favour of beginning by attempting at least to link to the other parts of what we currently term the United Kingdom, rather than narrow it down just to England. But you may have tried that already, and you may not have been able to establish the connections that you need. But I would be interested in hearing your own reflections on that perspective. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ken. So I'm going to bring Mike Hope in now.
Yeah, first, just the question of you raised, Carol, about what is the Crown? How do we, why do we talk about the Crown and what it is? I would say the Crown is the particular form that the state and state power takes in Britain. And it is traditionally, and this is where we come to the paradox of England and Englishness, because it has traditionally been England predominating over the Scots, who have been, well, first subdued very bloodily, and then drawn in as kind of colonial overseers and accessories in the adventures of empire, but never as equals. The Welsh were just crushed and considered sort of non-people who spoke an odd language by most English, and having had a childhood largely, well, a large part of it actually as an English boy in Wales, Welsh-speaking Wales. The incredible combination of ignorance and arrogance that English people display in relation to Wales. You will hear even now, BBC announcers who take great pains to pronounce things correctly, ritually slaughtering Welsh pronunciations because they really can't be buggered to, that's what it feels like. So there is this diminution of Wales. And as for Ireland, listen, we should not be talking about Northern Ireland. It is an illegitimate statelet created by British imperialism. There is the north of Ireland and there is the south of Ireland, which managed to gain a degree of freedom. But as we know from the likes of Connolly and so on, an Ireland unfree will never be at peace. And we are finally looking at the possibility of an Ireland which will actually overcome sectarian division to strive to reunify. All but the more extreme DUP loyalist Protestants, younger ones, see a better life linked to what was known as the South. So we are left with England. We are not talking about English exceptionalism. In fact, we are talking about the destruction of English exceptionalism, because the radical history of what peasant struggles, early citizen struggles and nascent workers' struggles in England have been suppressed and are hidden from history. And we've had some good introductions on the Levellers and on the 1832 general strike, on 1848, and so on and so forth, on the Chartists. That is largely hidden, but we do need to be able to wrestle that all those symbols of English exceptionalism and colonial dominance and reaction from the ruling class. And we do that by building fraternal relationships with Republicans in those other countries whose situation is different. We're not talking about English independence, but they are talking. There is a question of Scottish independence. There is a very probable question of Welsh independence. And most certainly, there is a question of Irish independence. We need to be able to say that we support you. That is the way in which we go from being nationalists into being internationalists. We say that the state, the crown, which dominates us, is a greater enemy than, workers and ordinary people in those other countries who want their own freedom. So that's how we do it. But we don't sort of deny that we're English. That happens to be where we are. And it has its very particular history, like I said. So that's how I would kind of defend the notion of starting in England.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mike. Yes, where we're coming from is the problem with the union it was imposed in 1707 with Scotland joining us then with the Act of Union. It was imposed by the elites. The people had absolutely no say in that situation at all. So basically, it's an abusive relationship with England telling Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, exactly how they're going to run their countries, and that isn't right. That, in my opinion, those abusive bonds have got to be broken so that a much healthier federation can form between the countries. We've got to break the old in order to bring forth the new. I'm just going to go back to Steve now. I don't see any other hands up, so I'm going to go back to Steve.
I was just going to say, I mean, I was going to, when the question about the crown, which you asked, I think I was going to suggest Phil gave us a take on it, but Mike did such a good job on it as well. But I don't think it will do us anything to have Phil's take on the same thing, but we're all saying the same. Mike did such a good job on Englishness as well, really. I think I'll go and just retire at this point. But I have a couple of points and then maybe we have just Phil's take on the crown, just to re-emphasize that point. The 1707 Act of Union, you're quite right, Carol. It was a forced marriage. It was like a shotgun wedding. It was never democratically agreed. It was imposed upon Scotland in conjunction with the certain Scottish elites who got jobs down in Westminster when their parliament was shut down. The Scottish people were never in favour of it, didn't want it. But of course, eventually, the expansion of the British Empire gave them jobs as soldiers and administrators. Eventually, the Scots quite liked the empire. They said, "Oh, okay, well, we can do all that. We can join in the plundering." But the people of Scotland never liked it in the first place. In fact, they were rioting against the Act of Union at the time that it took place. So it was imposed. It was posed by a combination of bribery and threats. Queen Anne threatened them with an army if they would be coming up, but she also bribed them all with a load of gold at the same time. And they were in a terrible state with what we call the Darien escapade, where they went to set up their own Scottish colony, which ended up in a complete and utter disaster and left the virtue of the country bankrupt. So a whole combination of things made it was not a conquest of Scotland in the way that Ireland or whatever, but as Mike already said, there was a whole series of Cromwell taking Scotland and other people invading Scotland. So we had a bloody history with Scotland. But anyway, I do want to maybe say this. We do get this from people saying, well, we shouldn't dabble in nationalism. But the fact is, Marx had this thing. He went to a meeting, I think, at the First International, and a lot of revolutionaries got up and said, we're not doing any nationalism. We don't do nationalism. We're against it. And Marx said to him, yeah, that's fine. He said, but you're talking in French, which is a language that about half the delegates here don't even understand. So the fact is that nations are real; they do exist, and we are living in England, and we have to come to terms with that. The thing about England, and I think it's significant, is that English. Whereas if you go to Scotland, Scottish nationalism is kind of left wing. Scottish republicanism is on the left wing of Scottish nationalism. We know Republicans in Scotland who we linked in, as Carol said. So slightly to answer what Ken said, well, no, we've got good links with them, and in fact, we'll get some of them to come to talk to us, perhaps during this election campaign. But in Scotland, nationalism and republicanism are kind of left wing. In this country, in England, nationalism is right wing. English nationalism is a big danger, because it's Anglo-British nationalism. It's British, it's England, it's the English. That's why Keir Starmer has two flags. He has a flag of St. George, I'm English, and the Union flag to tell everybody he's British. So that's Anglo-British two flags nationalism. And that is a very dangerous, because it gives the idea that to be English, you need to be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. You can't really be English if you're any other ethnicity. Now, that is a cultural nonsense, of course, and it doesn't do anything for the England that we're now living in, which is a completely different England. But that's where the right wing and the racists and the fascists can mobilize that reactionary form of English nationalism. English republicanism, therefore, is not an adjunct to English nationalism. It's the alternative to it. English nationalism is right wing. English republicanism is left wing, I would argue, because as Mike already said, it's about our own democratic, radical, working class traditions, and that's the tradition that we must conjure up against the Nigel Farages, the Rishi Sunaks, and the Keir Starmers, who are all playing the Anglo-British game. So I agree with Malcolm there, to go back to Malcolm, but I agree that England is a very deeply divided country, and one of the big fractures is the North-South divide. You know, that's deep, it's economic, it's cultural, it's social, but what we're talking about is overcoming that divide, uniting the people of England, and they can't be united if the people in the North are all second-class citizens, which they are under this regime. I mean, you see the amount of money invested in the North compared to what's invested in London. It's ridiculous. Yeah, I'll stop there. So maybe I see that Jennifer's got a hand up as well, and maybe we might hear Phil on the Crown. I don't know.
Yes, I'm going to bring Jennifer in now. Jennifer?
I just wonder, we talk about nations and so on. I just wonder if we're really getting to where the source of power is in our society, because I think we need to understand the power relations better before we can move forward. And I think, you know, the Marxist analysis of capital and labour no longer any good, because I think what we have is, and Grace Blakely talks about this, we've got a collaboration, if you like, of the elite, which is still, it seems to me, as strong as it's ever been, and is manifested at the top of corporations, public bodies, everywhere. We've seen that with the post office scandal. And the power of the commercial power and political power of corporations, which bypass the other structures. They might use the structure of the Crown, but actually they are very significant in themselves as sources of power. And I think we can't ignore that. And what happens is that we get the elites and the corporates ganging up together to provide corporate welfare, and that's why the rest of us are so poor. There is no room for us because they take it all. It goes to the corporations. And I'd just like sometime in the future to maybe talk about other ways of finding grassroots power. There's a strong, fairly strong community wealth building movement and cooperatives. And you've mentioned people's assemblies and so on. And sometime I'd like to explore how we can maximise the value of those developments as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. I would just say to you, if we changed the political structure as much as we would like to, then I don't think those corporations will have the power that they have at the moment to affect the political process. If we have grassroots, as you're talking about, citizens' assemblies, regional assemblies, democracy coming from below, so without career politicians, for instance, they won't be lobbied. Those people hopefully will not be so subject to the lobbyists who try to buy them off at the moment. So I think changing the political system will have a big effect on the amount of power that the corporations can yield. That's just my opinion. So I'm going to bring Phil in now.
No, I think the big reason to be a Republican is to be a Democrat, and I think in the course of developing a Republican state, or whatever it will be called, a republic, we might find we're traveling with nationalists as well, because I think the things are on a kind of continuum. I don't actually have a problem with nationalism, provided it's a kind of transitional thing on towards a democratic state, and doesn't go down a rabbit hole of right-wing fascism in this country, or indeed, fastening on. Because if you look at some of the SNP noises they make, they come across to me as very conservative in a lot of their social attitudes and so on. I don't like the sound of that very much. But nevertheless, they are better than anything else in Scotland that's likely to be able to get a majority there. I think the thing about the Crown is I've been watching the Post Office recordings of the interrogations of these various people it's just incredible, the fact that they don't seem to think, half of them don't seem to think they've done anything wrong at all. They live in this kind of shared play of attitudes that they generally don't really believe that they've stepped out of line. I mean, they can be shown two contradictory documents that they've both signed, both of them, and they don't make any kind of attempt to sort of excuse themselves. Just say, well, it's what I knew at the time. I mean, it's like they've been given a coaching book, a name and number thing. Like when you're captured in a war, you just give your name and number. It's more or less like that. So I think one of the things we've got to deal with is the inherent lack of democracy which is in our institutions. And so when we're talking about companies and large multinationals and things, yes, of course, they don't have any kind of, they are undemocratic, etc., but they're not outside the Crown. They're part of the network that they feed off one another. I mean, the multinationals couldn't function in Britain without the Crown, and the Crown probably couldn't function without the multinationals. And then there's the tax havens, which is another area we need to look at. There's an excellent documentary on YouTube, Spiderweb. I mentioned it already, but I'd mention it again. The Spider's Web, I believe it's called, and that goes in detail into the structure of how finance is really ridiculously skewed. And when they're going on about, oh, we haven't really got enough money because, Richie blew it all on PPE. Well, Richie blew bugger all on PPE compared to what's in our tax havens. And we make no attempt to do anything about that. So the problem we have is then, in summary, to me, is a question of how do we increase our reach. And I think the one thing that is coming out of this whole thing, you hear it a lot on radio phone-ins and things, they're all the same. Well, yes, the question is why? And the why is answered by the fact that they subscribe to the same structures which are inherently undemocratic. And if you're undemocratic, you've got to be the same as the other person who's undemocratic, because the Labour Party can't call for a republic. It can't call for abolition of the monarchy, because they're all signed up to the union and the monarchy. So, even if they go into Parliament, they can't. They have to. Jeremy Corbyn had to take the oath. I mean, it's ridiculous. So, I feel really it's democracy that we need to be pushing. I think we need to break this whole problem down into bite-sized chunks, which hopefully this election campaign, even if we don't look like we're going to be sending anyone to the Crown's Parliament, we can at least have some good discussions about themes we'd like to develop in the future. And I think Steve's right. I think an election gives us that opportunity. So I'll leave it there. But I do hope everyone gets an opportunity to watch the video that Sean made with us of the post office. It's very interesting. And there was a documentary on ITV last week. I watched this afternoon Panorama's 2015 John Sweeney documentary, which was also very good. But really, this is just going to go on happening because they are the cover-up. That's what they do. They are the mask of anarchy. They cover for all the anarchy that's going on behind it. And Shelley nailed that 200 years ago, and I'm afraid to say nothing has changed. And when people say to me, what does anarchy mean in the poem, Shelley's poem? Well, anarchy is the state. It's the state that does what it likes and destroys lives and makes people miserable and hives off all the wealth. That's anarchy. And so in that sense, Shelley's analysis is as good now as it was then.
Absolutely, Phil. Excellent. I just want to bring Mike in again.
I think that I agree with almost all that Phil said, actually. But no, I just wanted to move it along a bit in terms, having laid out our values, which we can carry on discussing, but there's also our sort of strategy and tactics. And just one or two observations. Steve and I managed to miraculously rendezvous with each other at the last big Palestine demo, and Steve had cunningly concealed on his person the flag. So we brought out the flag and we displayed the flag and we carried the flag, and it attracted a great deal of attention, quite almost suspicious at first, but as we explained it, it really seemed to be quite a positive point in all of this. People were, there was, I don't think I encountered anybody, I don't know about you, Steve, who really disagreed with us in terms of what we were doing and why we were doing it. And also, the focus in particular upon England, but with reference to the rights of the other constituent parts of the UK to have, to determine their own futures. So yeah, I think the flag is something we do need to think carefully about how we sort of use it to best advantage. I think it can be quite powerful. The other thing is this, sort of electoral list. I know I put on WhatsApp something that had come from another WhatsApp group on Gaza about sort of a suggested list of candidates. And Steve, you kind of repeated that. I have to say, I would really struggle to support, we've talked about Galloway, we talked about Chris Williamson. I would struggle to support those people. I really would, even though they might have a stance on Gaza, which I do think is the predominant question at the moment. It is the big divider. However, on other matters, whether it's just sort of backwards pandering in the case of Galloway, and as Phil described it, you didn't say Stalin. I said Stalinism, and you actually described Williamson as Assadism. That's right. And I think we do have to be quite clear about those people we support. Generally Greens, yes, but Greens are a variable crowd. There's quite a lot of issue building at the moment because Greens are standing against Corbyn in Islington North. And, actually, I think that's going to be resolved and they will step down, almost certainly. I mean, Corbyn, by no means perfect, just a left social democrat, really. But I think because of his stance on Gaza in particular, and his one in the eye to Starmer, they are two very good reasons why we do have to support Corbyn.
Thanks very much, Mike. Phil's got his hand up again, so I'm going to bring Phil in.
Yeah, very quickly, a few things. Diane Abbott's been slung out of the Labour Party. So that kind of, to me, I think is going to be a determinist break for those who hung on in there, hoping that Starmer might trip under the 38 bus that does go to Hackney, or the 73 even. I'm not choosy which one he falls under, provided it's one or the other. or he can choose any bus he likes, or underground train, perhaps. The next thing I was going to say is that the question of Palestine needs to bend arc back into this country, because ultimately what Britain does through its so-called soft power is perpetuate the same relationship to the world as it always has. It's an imperial country in decline, that's true, but it still packs a lot of weight in terms of arms supplies and all the rest of it. So Palestine is also a national issue, and therefore it's important to talk to the Palestinians or people who are supporting the Palestinian struggle to say, hang on a minute, what are you doing here to advance democracy and Palestinian politics, which can be recognized and built in this country? It's not sufficient once this phase of the war, like Operation Cast Lead or Protective Edge, or whichever one of the mowing of the lawns finishes sooner or later, this will, to just go back home and forget about it. That movement has to be built, and it has to be built on Republican precepts. So therefore, the flag is vital, and I agree with that. We need a load of them. And when we go on the demo, as Steve said, and Mike have pointed out, we need to have a nice punchy little leaflet that we can say, hey, just in case you don't see us again for a bit, take this leaflet, have a look at it, and contact us at this email address, and we'll tell you all about it. And I think actually that's probably the way we can use the Palestine struggle as well, to build our message and not do what George Galloway and John Rees did and try and build a sort of respect party. That's not what I'd want to be part of. I fear that's sort of what Galloway's doing again. It's Respect Mark II, because there were huge problems in Respect when I was a member of it for a few months about his social conservatism caused quite a lot of friction. And I wouldn't want to be in a club that had him as a member. So that's all I wanted to say, really. It's Palestine abroad, but it's Palestine here. It's an international question, I agree, but it has to be brought back into a national dynamic and a national dimension.
Thanks very much, Phil. Yes, I think what's important is we have a look at how are we going to get these ideas, how are we going to approach candidates, be they party members or independents, how are we going to approach them and ask them pertinent questions and get our ideas in there and say, look, you're only going to get our vote if we're going somewhere along this path. So really, how do we do this? How do we proceed? So I'll go back to Steve for that.
Yeah, I think we need actually you're quite right, the details of it. I think we need to have an all members and support and even supporters meeting to decide that in a quite concrete way. And we've got to do that fairly soon. We have to have the nitty gritty that Phil. I agree actually with what comrades have said. We have to have the nitty gritty, and I think Phil made the point that we've got a Republican movement on our streets. It doesn't think of itself as a Republican movement. It thinks of itself as a Palestinian movement. But in terms of what it is doing and what it means for citizen activism, it is objectively Republican, even if subjectively it's only thinking abroad, it's not thinking about England. And we have to say that, the fact is that the Crown is supporting Israel. And it's this lack of democracy that means that we're in the situation we are. So I agree with what Phil said. We somehow got to try to find a way to speak to this movement and say that we need to do something about England and the rest of the UK, by the way. I always say England and the rest of the UK. So that's how I think that we've got an audience, if we can find a way of reaching that audience, that would be open to those ideas. I think obviously for our election campaign, we want to promote the idea of another England. We want to promote that through the colours and flag that we use. We want to concretise the programme of a Commonwealth of England and make that case. We are anti-Tory, strongly anti-Tory, but we're not in favour of Starmer, but we're definitely anti-Tory. But it's the Palestine Party. Now, we obviously got to look at different individuals. We'll have to have further discussions about the Palestine Party. if we agree was it. I tend to say it's why we're doing something. Why is it that we're going to support the Palestinian Party? Because that's the most democratic part of England at the moment that we can see. And there are unsavory characters and all the rest of it. But I think we have to try to work out why we're doing something. And I think that's a further discussion beyond what we can do. What we can do here. I wanted to just go back to say a couple of other points. Back to Jennifer, what Jennifer said, and I agree with Jennifer to some extent. For us, republicanism is about power coming from the grassroots. It is about in the localities. It has to come from below, and there are lots of initiatives. Republicanism, in one sense, already exists in the kind of initiatives, Jennifer, that you mentioned. I think those are forms of grassroots organization. They're the things that we encourage, because we shouldn't just thinking it was get rid of the king is what republicanism is about. It's about the people themselves being organized in their communities, in their workplaces, in their trade unions. That's what we want to promote as a working class republicanism. But I would say that, of course, if we're going to talk about corporate power, the biggest corporation in the United Kingdom is the Crown. It's a massive multinational corporation. It's hugely powerful. And just to emphasize the point, if we look back for the 1,000 years of history, up until, I would say, till the English Civil War, to the Glorious Revolution, the Crown and the King were the same thing, and it was all about land. The Crown is the King is the Crown. But we got that separation of Crown and King through the English Civil War, through the Glorious Revolution, and then we created a corporate crown. And that was created by the City of London. So if land from 1066 to 1649 or 1688, land was the key issue. From that point on, the city and finance and banking, that was the key question. The Crown is really the front, if you like, for the City of London that stands behind it. And the link is, of course, through His Majesty's Treasury and the Bank of England. That's really what we have to, when we talk about Crown power, we're not talking about King, we're talking about the Treasury. And if you see the role played in the Treasury, in all of these crimes that we're going to be looking at over the next week, we will be looking at the crimes of the Crown. We will be looking, and I hope Jennifer's going to help us on this, to looking at the land question, because we were going to have, Jennifer was going to give us a talk. So we put all those things together as well. And we have to talk to Mike after this as well about how we coordinate with what he raised with us about a campaign he's involved in as well. So we have to get our act together, and we have to get the members together to a practical thing, to be able to get leaflets and things like that, so we can actually do a campaign. So I think I'm going to stop there. I think we have to work. I think we've got the broad framework of how we want to campaign. We have to just get down to the details of it and make it stronger. And hopefully we can do that, Carol. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Steve. And yeah, I think we've really only scratched the surface, I think, at this meeting, but we've actually covered, we haven't gone very deeply, but we've covered a lot of ground in the meeting. So I hope that everybody else found it interesting. And please, in the groups, the email groups that you're in, please do feel free to email us with ideas of how to get these ideas into the mainstream, to the candidates, be they party candidates or independent candidates. We have to get these ideas into those discussions, so that people are actually seeing that what we're proposing is something extremely radical and extremely important if anything is going to change. One of the things that Steve said, one of the things people always say is, well, they're all the same. I was at my cousin's 70th birthday party, and my other cousin was saying, they're all the same. We can't trust any of them. They're all liars. And she's absolutely right. So we've got to change that system, and we need to get through to people that changing the system is the important thing, not moving deck chairs on the Titanic, just moving, one establishment party in for another, or one career politician for another. We've got to change the system. The democracy has to come from below, not top down. And these are the ideas that we have to get out there and confront these candidates with these ideas. So, Steve, thanks very much.
Can I just just one thing to say that we're going to have a meeting every Monday between now and the election. We've completely overthrown our previous education program that we were planning. We're going to meet every Monday, and it's going to be an educational talk, provided we'll have an educational issue, but will also be an opportunity for us to discuss. It'll be a two-part meeting. One of it will be practical. What can we do? How can we intervene? What do we need to do to intervene? We may have to have a members meeting before Monday, Carol. We'll have to talk about that after this meeting so that members can come together and we can actually work out the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts. But there will be a weekly meeting, 7 o'clock every Monday. I hope comrades will come, and we'll try and get some more people to come if we can and to set that up. But we will discuss how we can intervene in the Palestinian movement. That really was what our orientation is towards, with leaflets, with flags, with whatever we can do, how we can do that. I mean, whatever it is we can do, we're only a small group. We haven't got a lot of money either. But if we can double our impact or widen it 3 times, that would be great, wouldn't it? And we make new contacts. So I think we have to think of the election as a real opportunity, a time of intense political discussion when there'll be more interest in the kind of things that we're saying. And we're only preparing ourselves for when Starmer wins, if he does win. Those issues are going to come up, because at that point, people are going to become disillusioned with what's offer. Something rotten in the state of Denmark is not going to be solved by Keir Starmer, I'm afraid, because he's part of what is rotten in the state of Denmark. So I think that therefore people will look for an alternative. And we're presenting our politics in a different way to the rest of the left. And that's important. We're putting a different idea, a different solution, a different way forward. And so I hope that we'll be able to get our message out to a wider audience. So thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, everybody that's attended this meeting. And thank you for your contributions and your questions. And I hope we've given you lots of food for thought. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.